Okay, so picture this. Me, feeling reasonably intelligent, parting ways with a crisp 20 euro note for a story that, in hindsight, was about as believable as a unicorn riding a unicycle.
Oh dear.
The kicker. Just weeks later, here I am, knee-deep in why we humans aren't actually as gullible as that 20-euro-sized hole in my wallet might suggest.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
Totally.
Your experience, while perhaps humbling, perfectly sets the stage for what we're exploring. We tend to focus on those moments when belief goes sideways, but the reality is the vast majority of what we believe and who we trust turns out to be pretty solid.
Exactly. And it was that very question, why do we believe what we believe and trust who we trust, that one of you awesome listeners posted.
Oh, okay, listener request, great.
So for this deep dive, we're venturing into Hugo Mercier's Not Born Yesterday, The Science of Who We Trust and What We Believe. Now, this isn't a light read. It's a deep dive into academic research, looking at everything from major historical shifts to the fine print of psychological experiments. Right. It's thorough stuff. And if we zoom out and look at the big picture, Mercier's work really challenges this persistent idea that humans are inherently gullible.
Yeah?
I mean, think about the sheer volume of information, misinformation, and outright nonsense we encounter daily. If we were truly as easily fooled as some theories suggest, it's hard to imagine how society would even function.
Right. So our mission today, should you choose to continue listening, and clearly you have, is to pull out the key insights from Mercier that completely reframe this notion of human gullibility.
Okay.
We want to uncover the surprisingly sophisticated ways our brains act like little gatekeepers, constantly evaluating what comes in. Mercier calls this open vigilance.
Open vigilance. I like that.
Sounds intriguing, right? Essentially, it's our brain's built-in skepticism and evaluation system.
It does. And the first target Mercier takes aim at is this very case for gullibility.
We constantly see the same examples trotted out. Flat earthers, belief in witchcraft, QAnon conspiracies, historical blood libels. These seem to be exhibit A in the argument that people will swallow just about anything.
Yeah, those examples pop up and you can't help but wonder, how can anyone actually believe that?
Exactly.
But Mercier immediately throws a curveball. He points out that despite these attention-grabbing examples, attempts at mass persuasion overwhelmingly fail.
Ah, okay.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It is. Consider the historical evidence he lays out. Take medieval Europe, for instance. The church wielded immense power and actively tried to instill Christian beliefs, yet the rural population often stubbornly clung to pre-Christian customs.
Right, despite all that effort from the church.
Or think about modern political campaigns, all the glossy flyers, the endless robocalls. Research actually shows their impact on presidential elections is negligible.
Negligible, really, all that money.
Pretty much. Even the notorious Nazi propaganda machine, often portrayed as this incredibly effective tool of manipulation, couldn't actually make the German populace genuinely like the Nazis.
Mind blown. Seriously, we're so used to hearing about the power of propaganda and misinformation, but Mercier is saying, hold on, the evidence just doesn't back up this idea of widespread susceptibility.
Exactly.
And for you, our listener, who wants to feel less overwhelmed by the constant barrage of information, this is actually quite encouraging. It suggests we have a natural resistance to just being swayed by anything and everything.
Exactly. We're not just sponges. And Mercier also looks at how history itself has sometimes misinterpreted influence.
How so?
Think back to ancient Athens and the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides, and later Plato, blamed demagogues like Cleon for leading Athens to ruin, implying the public was easily manipulated by charismatic orators.
Right, the classic image of the fiery speaker swaying the mindless masses.
And we see similar stories with the Children's Crusade, this idea of innocent kids blindly following a leader.
Yeah, or the Enlightenment critiques of the church, portraying people as helpless victims of blind faith.
This raises a crucial question. Were these truly instances of widespread gullibility?
Well,
Mercier challenges this, suggesting these historical events were driven by a much more complex interplay of social, economic, and political factors, not just simple blind faith.
okay, so maybe those big historical examples aren't the clear-cut cases of gullibility we often assume.
Probably not.
But what about those really unsettling psychological experiments? The Milgram experiment.
Ah, yes.
The shock experiment.
Where people seem to administer increasingly painful electric shocks just because someone in a lab coat told them to.
Yeah.
It feels like pretty strong evidence of blind obedience, right?
This is a really important point, and Mercier offers a nuanced perspective on the Milgram experiment.
Okay.
While it's often cited as proof of blind obedience, a closer look reveals a more complex picture. Interestingly, initial compliance was high. All participants started by administering the slight shocks.
But widespread refusal only really began to emerge at the intense shock level of 300 volts. And even then, not everyone refused.
That's a key detail that often gets lost. It wasn't like everyone immediately cranked the voltage all the way up.
No, not at all.
And remember, the person supposedly receiving the shocks to the Confederate was expressing significant distress, even screaming in pain, mentioning a heart condition, and begging to be released.
Yeah, really laying it on thick.
Yet, as Mercier highlights, the majority still continued.
Exactly. And this prompts us to consider what was truly driving this behavior. Was it simply blind obedience, or were there other powerful factors at play?
Like what?
Well, the participants were clearly conflicted, caught between the instructions of an authority figure and the apparent suffering of another person. This complexity suggests that obedience in this context wasn't just about being easily fooled into following orders.
Okay, so if we're not just easily swayed by persuasive leaders or blindly obedient to authority, why do some misconceptions gain traction?
Right, that's the question. Mercier argues that the success of these ideas isn't just about the charismatic leader, the supply side, but also about the demand.
Demand.
Yeah, the pre-existing beliefs and goals of the people who adopt them.
Okay. So what people already want to believe or need to believe.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is that many popular misconceptions tend to remain somewhat isolated, almost like niche beliefs, and they often don't have a significant impact on our day-to-day lives. This allows people to entertain these ideas without them fundamentally altering how they navigate the world or what they truly believe on a core level.
Interesting. This leads us to a really interesting concept Mercier introduces: open vigilance.
Yes.
He argues that we've evolved a sophisticated set of cognitive processes that act like a security system for our beliefs. Essentially, it's our brain's built-in skepticism and evaluation system.
Precisely. Our mental gatekeeper. And to illustrate this, he uses some surprising examples from the animal kingdom.
Oh.
Think about babbler alarm calls. These calls warn other babblers of danger. But even lone babblers living on their own will still give these alarm calls.
Why would they do that if there's no one else around?
Exactly. Seems counterintuitive. And what about gazelles? They do this strange, high-jumping behavior called stotting when they spot a predator.
Stotting.
Yeah, it looks like it's slowing them down, making them more vulnerable.
Weird. Why?
What's fascinating is that stotting is actually a signal to the predator.
Really?
The gazelle is essentially communicating, look how strong and fast I am, you have no chance of catching me, so don't even bother.
Wow.
This is an example of costly signaling.
Costly signaling.
Costly signaling is when the very act of communicating a trait, like fitness, is difficult or expensive to fake, making the signal reliable. Only a fit gazelle can convincingly stot.
So the cost makes the communication trustworthy.
Exactly.
But how does this relate to us humans and our constant stream of verbal communication where we don't have these built-in costs for saying unreliable things? A gazelle can't fake being super fit, but, as Mercier puts it, a charlatan can definitely give me useless advice.
That's a great point. And Mercier argues that while our verbal communication doesn't have these inherent physical costs, we've evolved cognitive processes that act as a kind of virtual cost.
How does that work?
We tend to avoid sources that has given us unreliable information in the past, and we remember who said what, which can damage their reputation if they're consistently untrustworthy.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like we have an internal reputation tracker.
Sort of, yeah.
If you consistently feed me bad information, I'm going to stop paying attention to you. Okay, so if we have this evolved vigilance, what about those historical fears of easy manipulation, like brainwashing during the Korean War or subliminal advertising in the 1950s?
Yeah.
Those felt pretty real at the time.
Those are excellent examples of widespread anxieties about manipulation. The idea that American prisoners of war were being systematically brainwashed by communist forces was a major concern during the Cold War. And the fear of subliminal messages, like fleeting images of drink Coke in movies or the word rats subtly embedded in political ads, really captured the public imagination.
I remember hearing about that rats ad. It felt so sneaky, this idea that our subconscious could be so easily influenced without us even knowing.
Right. Very unsettling.
And the common narrative about children being these blank slates, incredibly susceptible to advertising, that's a persistent one too.
It is, but what's interesting is that the strong evidence supporting the effectiveness of these methods is actually quite weak.
Oh, really?
Despite widespread fears, brainwashing attempts during the Korean War didn't lead to mass conversions. And the power of subliminal messages has been largely exaggerated in popular culture. As for children, while their cognitive abilities are still developing, research suggests that as they grow older, they actually become less gullible, not more.
That flips the script.
Yeah.
So this idea that a lack of sophistication automatically equals easy credulity might not be accurate.
Doesn't seem to be, no.
And Mercier also touches on the popular idea of System 1 and System 2 thinking.
Ah, Kahneman's work.
Yes. The initial thought might be that our fast, intuitive System 1 is the gullible one, always ready to believe whatever it hears.
Well, Mercier offers a more nuanced perspective. He argues that System 1 isn't simply gullible and biased to believe. In fact, it can be biased to reject messages that clash with our existing knowledge or come from sources we don't trust.
Okay, like an initial filter.
Think about it. Your immediate reaction to someone saying soft soap is delicious is probably disbelief, not instant acceptance.
True. Yeah, definitely not. And he even points out that over-reliance on our slower, more analytical System 2 can sometimes lead us to accept flawed arguments, especially if they sound impressive or sophisticated. It's like we can get so caught up in the reasoning that we overlook the basic flaws. He uses the example of intellectuals sometimes embracing initially implausible ideas.
Exactly. So the interplay between our different ways of thinking is much more complex than just a simple division between a gullible gut feeling and rational thought.
Okay, so we have this open vigilance system. What are the key ways it works? Mercier breaks it down into several important mechanisms.
Right.
Starting with what he calls plausibility checking.
Yes. This is a fundamental aspect of our cognitive defenses. We constantly compare new information with what we already believe to be true.
Okay.
That immediate rejection of soft soap as edible is a clear example of plausibility checking in action.
Makes perfect sense. We have this existing understanding of the world, and new information has to at least somewhat align with that framework to be readily accepted. What's the next tool in our vigilance toolkit?
Reasoning. Arguments provide us with the connections, the dots, as Mercier describes them, that help us accept new conclusions, even those that might challenge our existing beliefs.
Okay, so like logic.
Think about the scenario where you're deciding whether to take the metro or the bus, and a colleague explains that the metro conductors are on strike. That logical argument provides a reason to change your initial plan.
Right, the argument provides the justification. And Mercier mentions the Socratic method as a great example of guiding someone to a conclusion through a series of reasoned steps.
Exactly.
It's not about just telling them the answer, but helping them connect the dots themselves.
Precisely. Even when our initial gut feelings might lead us astray, well-reasoned arguments can help us arrive at a more accurate understanding.
Next up, trust. This feels like a really big one. How do we decide who to trust in this world overflowing with information?
Yeah, it's huge. Mercier breaks trust down into several key elements. One is what he calls majority rules.
Majority rules.
We have an intuitive sense that if a lot of people agree on something, it's more likely to be true, even if we can't fully articulate why that is. He mentions an XKD comic about trusting a crowd to cross a bridge. We might instinctively follow the majority without deeply analyzing the structural integrity of the bridge.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a feeling of safety in numbers, a sense that the collective wisdom is probably onto something. But we also know that majorities can be wrong. How do we navigate that?
Well, we also have an intuitive ability to assess the dependence between opinions.
Dependence.
If three friends recommend a restaurant, but you later find out they all heard about it from the same initial source, you'll likely weigh their recommendations less heavily.
Okay.
We instinctively discount opinions that aren't formed independently.
That's clever. That's like we have a built-in filter for information cascades, even in our personal lives. What about detecting deception? That feels crucial for trust.
Yeah, you'd think so. But surprisingly, Mercier highlights the rather discouraging findings from lie detection research.
Oh.
Those behavioral cues we often associate with lying, like avoiding eye contact or fidgeting, are actually very unreliable indicators.
No way.
Seriously. Even experts whose job it is to detect lies perform only slightly better than chance when relying on these cues alone.
That's wild. All those TV shows based on reading microexpressions? Maybe not so accurate then.
Probably not.
So if we're not very good at spotting lies, how does trust even function?
Well, some researchers suggest that we might not need to be highly skilled lie detectors, because in reality, people might not lie as often as we think.
Hmm.
And when they do, the lies are often relatively minor. So we might operate on a general assumption of truthfulness.
A default to truth.
Sort of. But perhaps more crucial for building trust is the perception of aligned incentives.
Okay, explain that.
If we believe someone's goals are in line with our own, we're much more likely to trust their information. Mercier uses the powerful example of German and American soldiers who relied on each other for survival during the war,
Wow.
illustrating how shared goals can foster trust, even between former enemies.
That makes perfect sense. If you know someone benefits when you benefit, you're more likely to believe they have your best interests at heart. What else influences our trust?
Commitment. We pay attention to how committed someone appears to be, to their statements and their track record of following through on promises.
Right, their reputation again.
If someone makes bold claims but has a history of being wrong or unreliable, we'll adjust our level of trust accordingly. Mercier even mentions the idea that elephants do not forget when people have been overconfident.
Haha, I like that.
Ultimately, deciding who to trust might be less about being a human lie detector and more about identifying who is diligent in providing useful information driven by those aligned incentives.
So it's less about spotting the villains and more about recognizing the reliable allies.
Pretty much.
And what about when we first encounter someone? If we know nothing about them, what's our default setting? Skeptical? Trusting?
Mercier suggests that in the absence of positive cues, our initial tendency is to be conservative, to be skeptical of new information, and to distrust unfamiliar individuals or entities.
Okay, so cautious.
This is why name recognition and branding can be so effective. They provide that initial positive signal. But beyond just familiarity, perceived trustworthiness, the sense that someone cares about our well-being, often outweighs even expertise.
Ah, interesting.
Think about celebrity endorsements.
Yeah.
Their perceived trustworthiness with their audience can be more influential than their actual knowledge of the product.
Right, yeah.
The same can be true in the political arena.
Okay, we've covered plausibility, reasoning, and trust. The final piece of our open vigilance toolkit is emotional vigilance. I always thought emotions were just contagious, like if someone around you is panicking, you'll automatically panic too.
Yeah, that's the common idea. But Mercier offers a more nuanced view than simple emotional contagion. He introduces the idea of emotional vigilance,
Okay.
our ability to adjust our reactions to emotional signals
Yeah.
based on who is expressing them and the context of the situation.
So we evaluate emotions too.
Even infants, as he illustrates with the classic visual cliff experiment.
Oh yeah, with the glass floor.
That's the one. Where babies gauge depth based on their mother's facial expressions, engage in a form of plausibility checking with emotions. They only heed their mother's warnings when the situation is ambiguous. If the cliff clearly looks safe or clearly dangerous, they tend to ignore her emotional cues.
That's fascinating. So even very young children aren't just blindly reacting to emotions. They're also evaluating the situation.
Exactly.
You mentioned adults do this too.
Absolutely.
Huh.
Adults also modulate their emotional responses based on the context and their relationship with the person expressing the emotion.
How?
Studies have shown that people will mirror a smile or a frown more readily depending on whether they anticipate cooperating or competing with the person displaying the emotion.
Oh, wow.
And this suggests a sophisticated level of emotional processing, not just automatic contagion.
So those dramatic portrayals of mass psychogenic illnesses or panicking crowds, are they also more complex than just simple emotional contagion?
Mercier argues that these phenomena are better understood through the lens of adaptive responses filtered by emotional vigilance.
Okay.
Mass psychogenic illnesses often affect individuals experiencing stress, and the symptoms might serve an unconscious function. As for crowds, the depiction of them as irrational, panicking mobs is largely a myth not supported by historical evidence.
Really? Not even in disasters?
Even in incredibly frightening situations like the 9/11 attacks or the Bataclan shooting, survivors often reported more instances of calm, rational behavior and mutual support than widespread panic.
That's actually really comforting to hear. This is really making me rethink how easily influenced we are, both intellectually and emotionally.
It challenges a lot of assumptions, right?
Totally. So if we have all these vigilance mechanisms, why do mass persuasion attempts even happen? And why do some appear to have limited success?
Well, Mercia argues that even when demagogues or prophets seem successful, they're often responding to existing public sentiment rather than simply dictating it.
Ah, so they're reflecting, not just directing.
Exactly. Hitler, for example, initially downplayed his anti-Semitic views because they didn't resonate with the broader German population at the time.
Mm.
And when seemingly irrational mass movements occur, like the Exosa cattle killing,
Right.
there are usually deeper social, economic, and political factors that provide a more comprehensive explanation than just blind faith in a charismatic leader.
So these weren't just cases of people being easily fooled. There were underlying, more complex reasons for these events.
Almost always, yes.
And what about more modern attempts at mass persuasion, like political campaigns and advertising? They spend enormous amounts of money trying to sway our opinions.
You certainly do. But the research on the actual effectiveness of political campaigns and traditional advertising is surprisingly modest.
Modest.
The old hypodermic needle theory, the idea that media directly injects beliefs into our minds, has largely been debunked.
Okay.
The era of minimal effects in political communication demonstrated that campaigns often reinforce existing views more than they change minds.
So they preach to the choir, basically.
Yeah. Often, yes. Even sophisticated techniques like those employed by Cambridge Analytica seem to have had a more limited impact than initially feared.
Huh.
Almost more of a scam in terms of actual persuasive power, as Mercier suggests.
Wow. So all those targeted ads and carefully crafted messages, we're not just passively absorbing them and automatically changing our votes or buying habits.
It doesn't seem like it works that way, no.
Yeah.
The primary effect of news media, for example, appears to be in providing information, which can actually lead to a more informed and therefore less easily persuaded electorate.
Less persuaded. Interesting.
And even in advertising, for truly interchangeable products like Coke and Pepsi, it's difficult to argue that advertising truly creates a deep-seated desire.
Yeah, I guess brand loyalty is complex.
The limited success of mass persuasion attempts suggests this underlying cautious evaluation based on our existing beliefs and the perceived reliability of the source.
Okay, so we're not as easily manipulated as we might have thought. But if that's the case, why do some misconceptions, like wild rumors, still spread and persist?
That's a good question. Mercier explains that the efficient spread of accurate rumors relies on repeated feedback and the ability to verify the information against our existing knowledge.
Okay.
However, the acceptance of false rumors isn't necessarily a sign of failed vigilance. Often, these remain what he terms reflective beliefs.
Reflective beliefs.
Beliefs that don't have significant cognitive or behavioral consequences in our lives. Believing that most stars are larger than the sun is an example. It might be true, but it doesn't really change how you live your life.
That makes sense. It's like we can hold certain beliefs in our minds without them really impacting our core thinking or actions. What about the source of the information? That seems really important for rumors.
Absolutely. We intuitively evaluate the source. If a trusted friend enthusiastically recommends a movie, we're more inclined to believe it's good.
Right.
But if someone vaguely says, "Someone told me Paul is pregnant," the lack of a clear, reliable source might actually decrease our belief. And then there's the issue of hidden dependencies and circular reporting, where seemingly independent reports actually originate from the same unreliable source, as we saw with some of the faulty intelligence leading up to the Iraq War.
Right. It looks like multiple sources agreeing, but it's really just one bad source echoed.
Exactly. It sounds like a crucial part of our vigilance is trying to trace information back to its original source and assess its trustworthiness.
Which is hard work sometimes.
It is. And what about really deeply held beliefs, like religious beliefs? Mercia points out they're often determined by where someone is born, not by individual logical reasoning. Is that a failure of vigilance?
Good question.
Not necessarily a failure of vigilance in the traditional sense, but it highlights the powerful influence of social transmission and cultural context in shaping our belief systems.
Okay.
This underscores Mercier's point about the importance of reflective sourcing, consciously evaluating the reputational path and the potential motivations behind information, especially in our digitally interconnected world.
And then he delves into some really intriguing examples, like the historical phenomenon of witches' confessions.
Ah, yeah, that's fascinating stuff.
Why would someone confess to something so unbelievable and self-incriminating?
Mercier explores a range of contributing factors, from the intense pressure of interrogations and prevailing social beliefs, to the fact that in some societies, confessing witches actually received more lenient punishments. He even discusses the Azan babies' belief in witchcraft, where it coexists with a practical understanding of natural causes.
So they believe in witches and know how things actually work?
Kind of, yes.
Hmm.
But perhaps most interestingly, he connects these confessions to the inherent believability of self-incriminating statements as a way of signaling loyalty or defiance.
Signaling? How?
Consider those bizarre pronouncements praising leaders like Kim Jong-il or claims that the Earth is flat. These extreme beliefs can act as a form of burning bridges, signaling unwavering commitment to a particular group.
Whoa. That's a really thought-provoking idea that these seemingly nonsensical beliefs can actually serve a social purpose.
Right, it's not just about the content of the belief.
And he also discusses the shallow nature of some counterintuitive beliefs and the guru effect. What's happening there?
He argues that beliefs that are incomprehensible or directly contradict our intuitive understanding often remain reflective and don't really impact our intuitive systems.
So they stay on the surface.
We might intellectually agree with a complex theological concept, but it doesn't necessarily change how we intuitively experience the world. The guru effect describes how obscurity can sometimes enhance perceived expertise.
The harder it is to understand, the smarter they seem.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Leading people to invest significant effort in trying to decipher nonsensical statements, like those famously associated with Lacan. It's almost as if the difficulty of understanding is mistaken for profound wisdom.
So we might be swayed by complexity or impressive credentials, even if we don't actually understand what's being said.
It's a potential pitfall, yeah.
And then he touches on the strategies of taking sides and skillful conmen. How do those fit into our understanding of vigilance?
Taking sides, even in a seemingly small way, can be a highly effective tactic for individuals and media outlets to gain our trust by appearing to be our allies.
Right, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Exactly. However, this could also lead to biased portrayals and the creation of a more polarized worldview than might actually exist. Skillful con artists, like those behind the Nigerian prince scam, ironically demonstrate a general lack of gullibility.
Oh.
By crafting messages that are so obviously outlandish that they filter out anyone who isn't already highly susceptible.
It's almost like the sheer absurdity of the scam is a deliberate feature, not a flaw.
That's the argument. It weeds out the cautious people immediately.
And he concludes by highlighting the asymmetry between trusting and mistrusting, suggesting that individuals who are more inclined to trust might actually become better at discerning who should be trusted through their increased engagement.
Exactly. By being more open to engagement, they gain more information and refine their ability to assess trustworthiness over time. It's a learning process.
So, to bring it all together, this deep dive into Mercia's work really challenges this common notion that we're just easily fooled.
Yeah, fundamentally.
He argues that the spread of most misconceptions isn't primarily due to our inherent gullibility, but often relies on some level of intuitive appeal or even serves a social function.
Right.
And even those strongly held but non-intuitive beliefs often remain quite separate from our core thinking and actions.
Precisely. The central takeaway is that humans possess these surprisingly sophisticated mechanisms of open vigilance that make us far more discerning than we typically give ourselves credit for.
So here's something to really think about. If we are naturally equipped with this open vigilance, how can we better understand and address the underlying needs or motivations that make certain seemingly irrational beliefs appealing or even useful for individuals and groups? Maybe the key isn't just about debunking the falsehoods, but about understanding the deeper reasons behind the belief itself.
That's a crucial point to ponder, isn't it? Perhaps by focusing on the social and psychological functions that beliefs serve, rather than solely on their truth value, we can develop more effective ways of navigating the complex world of information and belief that surrounds us.